Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to Readyforce's first session in a new speaker series called Startup Life. We're thrilled to have two amazing guests with us tonight, as well as to welcome students from 20 universities across the country to tonight's program. Readyforce is building a career network for college students, and we're always looking for new and innovative ways to connect students to business leaders and companies of all different sizes. And tonight's program, Startup Life, is designed to give students some inside knowledge and inside track into what it's really like to work at two different startups, SoundCloud and Square. We know that many of you struggle with ways to figure out how to connect with startups, how to make career decisions about big companies versus small companies, startups versus more developed businesses, and we hope tonight's program will help you learn a little bit more about making the right career decisions. My name's Alex Mooradian, and I'm the CEO of Readyforce, and I'll be moderating tonight's panel. And I'm here pleased to introduce our two speakers tonight. First, we have Zach Brock, who joined Square in 2010. Over the last 3 years, he's worked on a variety of different projects, from their original risk systems to leading their growth efforts. He's currently an engineering manager and is responsible for their international engineering team and rolling Square's products out throughout the world. Previously, he worked at Pivotal Labs and Z-Vents. Zach's also very active on Quora, so you should follow him there. We also have Paul Osman, who is the developer evangelist at SoundCloud. Paul travels around the country talking about, in the name of hacking, sharing SoundCloud's APIs, and growing their developer community. Quite often this entails online documentation, writing technical articles and blog posts, and generally creating inspirational hacks and coming to events like tonight. Prior to joining SoundCloud, Paul worked at Mozilla and also at FreshBooks. So what I'd like to do is have Paul kick us off tonight. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Paul, and about your company.
Right on. Thanks, Alex. So as Alex mentioned, I work on the platform team at SoundCloud, mostly getting my hands dirty with anything involving our API. So like you said, that can mean going to hack events, that can mean working on developer tools, but also providing insight to our engineering team, because I work with partners so often, I have a unique opportunity to sort of help shape the product roadmap. Before SoundCloud, I was the team lead for the API and integrations team at FreshBooks, and most recently worked at Mozilla. So there's been a common thread of working on platforms and working with developer communities throughout my career. Fairly active in startup communities in a number of different cities with all the travel. Spend most of my time in Toronto, New York, San Francisco, Berlin, and get really good opportunities to talk to folks from a variety of different startups there. So we're here to talk about like startup life and what it's like to work at startups. And in order to do that, I think it's really useful to at least set some definitions, because people tend to use the word startup to define a pretty broad set of companies. So from my perspective, I tend to think of a startup as any company that's really designed to grow really quickly. Usually that comes with a business model that's based on growth and user adoption. So I'll be talking about companies in that sort of space. So there's two different kinds, in my opinion. There's probably many more, but two immediately come to my mind, and that's really early stage startups and more established startups. So early stage would be sort of pre-launch, pre-getting to market. Established would be, you've got your product to market, you know what you're doing for the most part, you've tested it, it's successful, there is a market for this, and you're really trying to improve, iterate, and increase the quality of what you're delivering. So that often also kind of relates to big company versus small company. And my experience is, working at companies of various sizes, the smaller a company is, it's pretty obvious the more accountability you're going to have. So, if you're in a 5-person startup, everyone sees what you do, and you have a huge amount of opportunity to impact the overall product development culture of the company. Whereas if you're working for a 5,000-person company, unfortunately, chances are you might be able to hide in the bureaucracy somewhere and just sort of hope no one notices. So I think it's when I think about startups, I think it's really the responsibility of companies to try to manage that growth curve. So as they grow, try to scale their culture in a way that you still have impact on overall product decisions, on overall culture decisions, et cetera. And you're still, hopefully as accountable as you would be in a company with 5 other people. So, when thinking about from a student's perspective, when you're looking at different companies to work for, that's one thing that I definitely suggest to look for is any signs that people at all levels of the company, in all different departments of the company, are really accountable and really have ownership over the work they do. That's something that I personally enjoy looking for in different companies. So, I've worked for a variety of companies in my career, but obviously here to talk mostly about SoundCloud. So I'll just give a brief overview of who SoundCloud is, how we got started, where we're at now, et cetera. So the company started in 2007. Two founders, Alex Young and Eric Walforce. Product launched in 2008. And we've had pretty rapid growth. So in February of 2011, I think we hit our 3 million registered users mark. Nowadays, we have 180 million people who are interacting with SoundCloud at some point every month, which is pretty nice. We're at approximately 200 people now, almost 50-50 engineers to non-engineers, with offices in Berlin, London, Sofia, Bulgaria, and San Francisco. So getting to be pretty spread out. In terms of the engineering culture, we have a variety of different teams. We try to organize our engineers around shared goals rather than specific products. So we have teams who work on things like our data processing team, or our HTML5 team, or we do have an API team, for instance. But it's been really interesting for me personally over the last year and a half that I've been with SoundCloud, just seeing the product scale and then how we scale our engineering organization to meet some of those challenges. In my experience, another thing to look for at different startups is kind of the tool culture. So you get some companies who have a very top-down approach to process and to technologies used or something like that. And that can work in some cultures. I tend to not prefer it, so it's really up to, I think, the individual, what kind of company they're looking for. At SoundCloud, we have a sort of unofficial policy when choosing technologies. It's, choose the right tools for the job, but also have empathy. So meaning, if Haskell will solve your problem, sure, maybe you want to use it, but do you know that many people can maintain a piece of software written in Haskell? So maybe choose something a bit more mainstream. But for the most part, you're free to choose technologies. What that's resulted in is we tend to have, we started out as a Rails app. We now have Ruby. We still ship a lot of Ruby code, but we also have Go, Scala, and R actually in pretty critical parts of our infrastructure, which is neat to see. Also pretty early adopters of various non-language technologies, like pretty heavy users of Cassandra, RabbitMQ, HA proxy, et cetera.
Is that driven by employees mostly?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's completely engineering driven. So like I said, use the right tools for the job, but also have empathy for your colleagues who are going to have to maintain and know about this stuff.
Particularly for whoever's on call.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. A
little background on Square.
I'll try to follow that up. So Alex actually did a pretty good job of introducing me. So I've been at Square for a little, just about 3 years. And when I started, there were about 20 people. Now we're at over 400, mostly in San Francisco. Also about half and half engineering / design and business folks. It's been really like a remarkable journey. Like I joined right before we sort of launched in the United States, and I think we were sort of right at the tail end of that first kind of startup that you talked about of trying to find product market fit. Like we launched, we clearly had something that resonated with people, they were excited about, that offered like a real value proposition. And then the challenge was figuring out how do you take sort of that like initial wedge and expand it and try to grow that into like a big business and something that has a real impact on the world. So it's been a pretty interesting set of challenges. But as you mentioned, I've had a chance to work on a lot of different stuff. Joined as an engineer working on the server side, mostly Ruby and Rails when I started. We've since expanded into mostly still Ruby and Java on the server side. We do a lot of JavaScript for rich client development, a lot of Objective-C for our iOS apps, Java for Android apps, and experimenting with a few other things sort of behind the scenes. Our machine learning team loves Python. We use Go for a couple of systems programming things, but our primary focus is probably Ruby and Java at the moment. We've got a big variety of problems that we're trying to solve. I think one of the challenges for any company, and particularly startups that are sort of focused on design and user experience, is making the end user experience seamless and hiding all the complexity that goes on behind that. And I think in a lot of ways, Square is sort of like an iceberg. There's this really simple user interaction that you get to experience. You swipe your card, everything kind of magically works. You get a text message with your receipt. You get to sign with your finger, but there's a ton of stuff that has to happen behind the scenes to make that happen. We have to run multiple data centers. We have connections to multiple banks. We have to deal with latency problems between the phone and the server, concurrency problems on the server side. We have a big risk and machine learning team. We have teams focused on everything about how you run your business, from backend analytics to managing your inventory to the experience of somebody actually logging in for the first time and going through the whole setup. So it ends up being a lot of interesting problems, and hopefully nobody ever sees them on the outside, which is kind of fun. But it's a lot of work in order to make that simple experience happen. So my team specifically is working on bringing Square around the world. So we launched our first international market at the end of October in Canada, which is great. And we're working on our second one right now. And bringing Square International is an interesting challenge. We get to deal with all kinds of interesting regulatory issues, and we need to build a lot of relationships in markets we go to. Moving money is a non-trivial exercise, so it's a big variety of problems everywhere we go. But one of the things that I love about working at a startup and a company that's going through sort of this hyper-growth phase is that it's never boring. Literally every week is a new challenge. Everybody on my team has to flex in all kinds of interesting directions. And there's lots of opportunities to sort of step up and take the lead on things. And I think that sort of startups encourage that kind of meritocracy in a way that maybe a 5,000 person company doesn't. And it's, we have people who joined the company a couple of months ago and are already leading like major initiatives. I think that's one of the things that I personally really enjoy about working there.
That's awesome. Great. Thanks for the intro, guys. So what we're going to do now is do a little bit of Q&A. I'll ask some questions, jump in when you guys see fit, and then we'll, at some point later this evening, we'll turn it over to get some questions from the students that are joining us from the different universities. So Paul, you had started off a little bit touching on this first question about the difference between different size companies and kind of what truly makes a startup. I'd love to hear from you guys when you think about a 10-person company versus a 100-person company or a 400-person company. What keeps it as a startup, and what are the big differences between the 10 and the 400-person companies?
Yeah, good question. So like you mentioned, I touched on this a little in my intro, and I think there's no one answer, because I think a lot of it depends on the company. And like I said, a challenge for companies is, as they grow, making sure that they sort of keep a lot of that accountability and impact that gives startups so much power. So when you're looking at companies, try to, interviewing with companies is always great, because, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, right? So imagine
Many students forget that, by the way.
That's right, yeah, and I think it's really important to know.
I think it's a good way to judge a company that you're talking to. It's like, if you don't feel like you got a lot out of the interview process, then maybe that company's not going to be a great fit for you.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Absolutely. So what I tell people sometimes when they're sort of going out in their first job hunt is, imagine your nightmare scenario. The company that you totally wouldn't want to work for in terms of how they work, how the process is. Imagine Dilbert cartoon or something like that. Try to suss out just how close, how far away is this company from that nightmare vision that you have. And like you said, if you get a chance to really get a lot out of the interview process, you should get a pretty good idea from that.
Yeah, I think, so Square is now both the smallest and largest company that I've ever worked for. So I've gotten a chance to see sort of two different sides of it. I think one of the trade-offs that you make is, when you're small, you have a chance to have a very big impact on a company scale. And you get a chance, there's not a lot of people to make decisions. Maybe you're the only iOS engineer, and so you get to just decide everything from maybe design to architecture to implementation details. And as the company scales up, you may have less sort of overall control over a particular aspect, but the impact that you can have on the world also scales up proportionally. So when you're 10 people and you have 10 users, it's very different than being a member of a 100-person team with 180 million users. I think that part's really cool. So there is some trade-off in terms of like individual accountability, but in terms of scale of challenge and scale of worldwide impact, I think you get a chance to have a much bigger one.
Yeah.
And what's the largest companies that you guys have worked at in the past? So you said this is the largest for you.
So I did an internship in college when I was at Intel. So that was much larger, and that was very similar to a Dilbert cartoon, actually.
Right. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. I had my first programming gig actually was at a telecommunications company in Canada, Bell Canada, 50,000, 60,000 employees. Pretty large.
Great.
And very Dilbert-like.
You've both mentioned hypergrowth. I'm not sure if that's a term that most students understand. Out here in the Valley, everyone talks about hypergrowth and all the VC funding culture. How do you guys define hypergrowth?
I don't know that I've heard a good formal definition. I think it's any company that's trying to grow as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. Like, I suspect it's probably the same for you guys, but our only limitation is how fast we can find really great, talented people.
Yeah.
We don't have, especially for engineering and design, we don't really have headcount restrictions. We just want to talk to every great person we can and convince them to come work for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's a good sign when you're in that stage, because what it means is that you've gone through that iteration, you found that good product market fit, and now your limitation is resources, is talent, is finding really talented people who are passionate about what you're doing. So for us, it's really been about meeting the challenges that are presented by being a successful product. So scaling on both technically and in terms of company size is a luxury problem. So that's what I'd sort of consider hypergrowth, is those companies that are lucky enough to be in that luxury problem category.
What's the range in terms of hiring happening at both organizations this year?
I mean, our goal is to more than double this year. So we're spend a lot of time interviewing and hiring and sort of growing the company. I think this is one of the things that sort of was actually surprising to me in joining Square was I joined as an engineer. I expected there to be interesting technical challenges for scaling up a product and dealing with this sort of as users came in, how do we actually scale up technically? And what I found is that the challenge of scaling the company and scaling the business and scaling the team is as big or bigger a challenge. That part's really fascinating to watch from the inside.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and another area where you can have impact at a startup, right?
Absolutely.
If you're working for a company that's growing this quickly, you can really contribute, especially as a new employee, being able to communicate your experiences, what worked for you, what didn't work for you about an onboard process, and then get involved and try to change some of that. Yeah, we're in pretty much the same boat. So when I joined a year and a half ago, we were less than half the size we are now, and we want to be twice the size we are by this time next year. So it's that curve.
A lot of people to absorb in a short time period, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you get good at as a company is onboarding new people, getting them up to speed, and to the earlier question about sort of impact, this is one of the reasons why people can have a big impact is you don't have time to sort of stick them in training for 6 months or a year. You expect them to hit the ground running and take on a project from pretty much their second or third day.
Well, let's dig into that point, because I think it's actually interesting for career choices for students thinking about their own personalities. What do you think are good characteristics for students that want to go to a larger organization, to kind of a mid-size organization, or even to a very, very early startup that's in that still product market fit phase?
I mean, I would suggest that people heavily explore startups. I think it's a great opportunity for somebody coming straight out of school. I think early in your career especially, you should optimize for learning. You should optimize for where you think you're going to get the most, because that is the sort of thing that compounds over time. And so the more you can learn earlier, the stronger you'll be as an engineer or designer or business person later on in your career. And I think startups, because of their very nature, are the best place for somebody who has a lot of raw potential, maybe not a lot of experience, to be challenged and be given great opportunities to get better very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think startups are the ideal place to learn. Something interesting I've noted just in my personal experience as an engineer, the sort of amount of problem domains that require very heavy specialization are getting fewer and fewer. Just, the nature of technology choices are changing all the time, kind of problems that we're facing are changing all the time. So one opportunity that you have a startup that you might not necessarily have at a larger company is that sort of flexibility that forces you to adapt and learn a broad range of things rather than go really, really deep and have 10 plus years experience in this one specific technology, which you're going to find that maybe there's not a market for down the road. In terms of what students can do to distinguish themselves, like if they're looking at companies that are, that actually I think it applies to all companies, but especially in startups, is definitely just make yourself as visible as possible. So, one of the things I encourage people to do is no matter what level they're at, if you're a first-year student, if you're well into a postgrad degree, try to get as much stuff that you can show people that you've built. So, whether that's contributing to open source projects, whether that's just hacking on side projects and having them on a domain that you can show people to or whatnot, showing that you have the ability to take a lot of knowledge but then apply that knowledge is really, really huge.
Yeah, I'd say the first thing that I do whenever I get a resume is search for that person on GitHub to see what they've contributed to, what they've worked on. And the one thing that always stands out for me on resumes is things that people have actually built. So if somebody has something in the Google Play Store or the App Store or a website they can show, that's the thing I'm going to be interested in more so than class projects or extracurriculars or anything like that. Because again, it's being able to demonstrate that you can apply the skills and actually do something.
Totally. And open source especially. I mean, the barrier is even getting so much lower. So these days, if you're hacking on a side project, chances are you're going to use an open source library or something like that, right? If you encounter a bug in that library, go and fork the repository on GitHub, find the issue. If there's not an issue, file a pull, or make your changes, submit a pull request. What that shows is not just your technical chops, which of course are important, but it also shows, how do you communicate, how do you deal with feedback and improve. So if the maintainer of a project says, hey, this is a great pull request, but can you please do this and this and this as well, or can you assign or attach tests to this or something like that, showing how you react to that. Really, it is putting your work out there, and it's giving people an opportunity to really see how you might fit.
Yeah, and open source maintainers are always happy to get contribution and engagement from the community. So it's, like you said, a very low barrier to entry. I don't think you don't have to worry about being an expert in some particular domain to fix something.
We have to talk about people who actually solve problems. That's the most important thing. It's not necessarily about writing code; it's about solving the user's problem.
And I think that maps really well to what what startups are looking for and the kinds of people who are going to succeed there. At a small company, there may be a less of sort of a support and mentorship network, but so it optimizes for people who are really good at managing themselves and motivating themselves and breaking down challenges and setting goals. And I think if you're the sort of person who likes to do that, a small company is ideal. If you're the sort of person who needs a little bit more structure and a little bit more guidance, you maybe do better at a slightly larger company.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. I'd love to. You guys do lots of interviewing of people other than a GitHub account. What else can students do to actually demonstrate initiative, demonstrate that they don't need a lot of support around them?
One of the things that I've found is a good predictor of success through the interview process is people actually reach out to me directly, or anybody at Square.
Be careful now. You're
hold on.
going to end up with tons
my
of
pitch for campus@squareup.com. You should email us. But anybody,
or their Readyforce account. That's
Readyforce,
That's right.
But people who are proactive and actually make an effort to reach out. So you mentioned I answer a lot of questions on Quora, and there are now probably 5 or 6 people who work at Square as a result of messaging me on Quora and saying, hey, I liked your answers, I was interested in this thing. Do you guys have any open positions for XYZ? And even if we don't have anything posted on the website, we're always looking to hire great people, especially in engineering and design, but also on the business side. And getting in touch with somebody at the company and showing that you're excited and passionate and sort of get what the company is doing, I think that is a really strong signal that you are a good fit.
And that touches on something that I think is often overlooked. If you're looking to work as a software engineer, you are part of a community, right? So, companies and people like us who work for these companies are not, in a separate category, right? Like you are participating in the very same online communities. You are, using the products, whether they're developer-oriented or consumer products. Chances are a thing or two about these companies, and there's a certain confidence that gets shown when somebody either reaches out to you directly or shows that they know a thing or two about your company and they're applying to your company for a specific reason beyond just, hey, I'm looking for a job with a company that manages to write software and ship it. Really showing that this is why I'm applying to you, and this is why why SoundCloud interests me or Square interests me.
You want to find somebody who's got passion for the product, passion for the business. I've had a few interviews before where you talk to a student, they haven't actually ever used the product before. And that's always a red flag for me.
Big red flag.
I've had phone screens where people continuously refer to the company as Square Up. Not actually recalled.
That's
but-
Not a good sign.
Yeah. And even, we've talked to some startups where you find some innovative students that are asking for, if they're, let's say they're in private beta, they're asking for access to the product before the interview because they really want to get in there and be able to demonstrate.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
They
that's a
know.
great sign.
Oh yeah, one more thing that just popped into my head is, most startups these days, there's a few that wouldn't, but most will have an API. So, if you're interested in working for that company, it's actually a great way also of getting a different perspective of that company. I mean, an API is a product of their tech culture, right? So check out their API, build something on their API, hack something together.
Yeah, if they try and give you a WSDL file on a SOAP API, you should probably go the other way.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, you know that this may not be the company for you. So
So I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm sure we'll get more questions about what life is like and kind of how to get a job at both of your companies. But I'd like to dig in a little bit more about kind of your own personal careers. So first question is kind of what's some advice that you would give to yourself, to your 20-year-old self?
That's a good question. I think there are probably two things that I would tell myself. One is work on more side projects. I think, especially as a student, that is the best way to get experience, is to try to build things, fail, try again, and then succeed, and go from idea to reality. That cycle is harder than it looks, and there's all kinds of interesting pitfalls and traps you run into. And the only way to sort of get better at it is to just do it over and over again. And the second one would be, I wish I'd taken more CS courses in college.
Interesting.
right on. Yeah, I think more side projects definitely, and then also just don't be so timid. So you look at if you're involved in open source, especially, you sort of see people who are maintainers of really popular libraries, or they've built something that a lot of people use. There is no difference between you and those people other than that they did it.
Yeah.
So don't feel like you ever have too little experience to write software. I mean, if you write software, you write software and make it good. Iterate, find out what works, what doesn't. But also, get involved in the stuff that you use. So if you're using open source software, even if you're using Rails, if you find a bug in Rails, go look and see if an issue has been filed. If not, file it.
Or
Definitely.
even better, submit a pull request.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that. I think that the only difference between people who are bad and people who are good is that people who are good used to be bad.
Yeah.
And the only way to get better is really just to practice. And
That's right.
Be willing to fail over and over again. And hopefully that failure is in the trying to deploy something to Heroku and just watching it crash out and having to debug it. But that's definitely the best way to get experience.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to fail.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you guys ended up at your companies. What was I always find there's always amazing stories about, I met somebody at a coffee shop or whatever it was. So how did you guys get to where you are today?
That's an interesting question. So getting to SoundCloud specifically, over my career, I've been lucky enough to build a really good social network that's also a professional network, full of really great people who are connected and whatnot. And I do the same. I help people out all the time. So if friends of mine if I find out actually that a talented friend of mine is on the market looking for work, I'm so glad, because I will go out and try to match them with companies that I know people who work at, or I know the founders or something like that. And that's what happened to me. I decided I was looking for my next thing, and I put the word out to a few select people in my social network who are great at knowing people, and before long I was introduced to a bunch of new opportunities, and SoundCloud was one of them. So ended up speaking to at the time our VP of platform, spoke to the founders, and just kind of got a general feel for what I was looking for what they were looking for, and it was a pretty perfect fit.
It just started off with a conversation first. There was no formal job description. It was more, hey.
So it turned out that there was a job description for the position. They'd had a really hard time filling it, so they were really glad to hear from me. And it's tricky sometimes, and I've noticed this too with people I know who are running companies who are trying to hire, and at SoundCloud. Sometimes you'll be looking for this specific set of qualities, and you'll go through and just nothing ever feels right, like no candidate feels right. But then if somebody comes along, so that's why I love helping people out when they're looking, because I'll get to know them, and I'll know a number of companies who are looking for people and be like, you would be great actually at this. That's really.
Yeah, I think that's an important point there, which is at Square, looking at our hiring numbers and our hiring statistics, referrals are by far the strongest source of really talented people. And I think a lot of it is knowing great people, working with them, and then if you do great work, people recognize that and remember it in the future. So my personal story for how I got to Square, I got a demo of the product in January of 2010, and was blown away. I was like, this is so obvious. How has nobody come up with this? It's like beautifully executed. And so I was like, wow, this is a really impressive company. That's cool. And so I started thinking about it. And then when I worked at Pivotal, there were a number of us who went over to work with Twitter to work on various problems that they had there and help them ship some products and fix some infrastructure stuff. And one of the guys I worked with got recruited to Square, and he was super talented. I really respected him. So after he joined, I called him up and sort of recruited myself. I was like, tell me more about this company you're working at. Went out for beers and interviewed like a week later.
So it's interesting. Both of these stories start with some initiative on both of your parts to go to those companies. You got personally introduced through your own networks. We had talked about initiative as an important factor for students earlier as well. And one of the things I consistently find is the students that keep following up, keep asking questions, keep demonstrating interest are the ones that eventually bubble up to the top.
Especially at a smaller startup. It's like, there's a million things like on fire. There's a million challenges every week, a million crises, and it's easy to just like totally innocently fall to the bottom of somebody's inbox. And being persistent, will definitely get you noticed.
Yeah.
We will all have hundreds of emails as a result of those conversations.
That is a problem that I'm happy to deal with.
That's true. That is true. But I think what it touches on is that that's the kind of quality that you also look for in a startup, right? As somebody who will say, "Hey, I really like what you're doing. Do you have time to chat?" Or I'm in San Francisco or I'm in Berlin or whatever. Can I stop by the office and grab a coffee? Those people are solving their own problems, right? Which is exactly what you have to do in a startup. Nobody's necessarily going to tell you this is the problem that you need to solve. You're going to have to look around and look for opportunities to have an impact.
Well, I think that's an attribute that a lot of people at startups share, is sort of refusing to get blocked. I think people who basically go through barriers when they get put up in front of them are people who tend to do well at very small companies.
So great.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You guys both have, in your careers, you're still doing some coding yourselves, but you're now doing some more management, you're building a lot of the developer community. I think a lot of students that are out there that are still studying CS don't necessarily know the choices in career paths. Talk a little bit about your decision to go along those paths, as well as kind of what are other choices that are out there for students that are studying CS and engineering.
I think this is one of the great things about joining a small company is you have a ton of opportunities open to you. Especially, even at a company that's getting up to the size of SoundCloud or Square, there's a lot of problems that cut across sort of what would be traditional domains, and you need people who can sort of flex across those things and do lots of different things. So somebody who has a good eye for design and understanding of product and project management, but is also a strong engineer, can have a chance to exercise all of those things. And so personally, I never really thought I wanted to be a manager. I liked building things. I liked building products for people. And as the company sort of started growing, there were new challenges that cropped up, and I just sort of tackled the things that looked interesting to me, and sort of accidentally ended up in a management position. And it turns out I really enjoy it. I love working with a team. I love bringing other people up and making my team as effective as possible, and helping to sort of put stuff out in the world for customers as quickly as we can.
Yeah. I think that aspect of being able to interact with people across an organization was really important for me. So I've always enjoyed being an engineer, and before SoundCloud, I was working in strictly engineering roles for 10 or so years. So I didn't take the decision lightly to move out of it, but what I thought about was, I really enjoy kind of translating technical problems into sort of non-technical audiences. I really like working with developer communities. I like kind of showing off what you can do with something by building demos on top of it, et cetera. And I really like working across an organization, and in a startup you can totally do that. So SoundCloud, any given day, I'll work with people from marketing, I'll work with people in our engineering team, I'll do a bit of product management or help out on that side. There's all sorts of, you can wear many hats basically.
And I'm sure if you wanted to go deeper into one of those particular things, it would be very easy to switch into that.
There'd be no barriers. Yeah. Really, it would be up to me to just start doing it, you know, and making sure that I wasn't dropping anything, but making sure that I was focusing more on that. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of opportunities for, if you're a CS student, you're thinking about what the sort of long game is, you can go as far as you want as an engineer, or you can end up branching out into non-engineering positions, and that would be engineering management, that would be product management, that could be developer relations. There's a whole assortment that's available to you.
I think a CS degree or an engineering background is a great foundation for pretty much anything.
Absolutely.
I think understanding how things are built, particularly how things are built in software, prepares you for almost any role in a startup that's focused on software.
Yeah. No, I know people who are successful, in roles everywhere from CTO to head of product to all sorts of, different specific roles who all come from engineering backgrounds, and it suits them really, really well.
Awesome. All right, let's transition a little bit and talk about your companies specifically. So, one of the things that a lot of students ask about is kind of what is the company culture and what is the engineering culture. So, I'd love to hear each of you talk about kind of how do you think about your overall office culture as well as the specific engineering teams.
So our engineering culture is really self-motivated. So like I mentioned, I think I touched on in my intro, we're not a very top-down process kind of company. It's really about, our engineers are split into teams that are based on, having shared set of goals. And for those teams, it's about figuring out what works for them. So it's not like you become an engineer at SoundCloud and you have to work with this specific, software design methodology and you have to work with these specific tools. Really, it's up to every team to decide what works for them. Through that, there's a certain amount of organic kind of consolidation. Like we all tend to use GitHub for our source control. We seem to use Trello mostly for managing backlog and product tickets and whatnot. And then the rest is just a total hodgepodge of tools that work for every team.
How big are the teams in general?
Usually we try to keep them to 5 or 6 people. Any more than that, and you start to get diminishing returns like communication barriers and stuff like that. What that allows is that, there's a lot of cross-team collaboration, obviously. So you can end up working, on any level of the product, but you do get enough specialization that, we have people who are really going hard on music information retrieval or search and discovery, or people who are going really hard on front-end technologies, et cetera, or mobile development. But we still allow that kind of cross-team collaboration. I've even seen people be like unofficially asked to be loaned out to another team just because they want to work on that stuff for a little while and see how their team does that. And we're totally supportive of that. Like you were saying, there's really no barrier if you want to go do something else.
Yeah, I think optimal resource allocation is a tough problem in any company, and one of the easiest ways to solve it is to make it very self-directed. It's like what the company's trying to do, figure out where you can do that best. But to answer your question about sort of engineering culture, I think it's sort of a tough question to answer because it's sort of asking a fish what water is like. But I can talk about the things I like best.
I'm going to cross that question out for the next section we do.
I can answer the things I like best about working at Square. I think it's small teams and like a chance to have an impact. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we're just doing so many things that even at 400 people, like the individual teams that work on these things are really small. So my team is 7 people right now, and we're responsible for launching every international market. So it's a lot of responsibility for people to take on, but it's also like a great opportunity to do lots of different things. I like the level of transparency we have. Our entire company sits in open plan office. Nobody has their own cubicle or like closed door office. And every meeting of more than like 2 people sends notes out to the entire company. So it's very cool. It's occasionally overwhelming, but it is cool to be able to dip in and see like how the finance team is deciding on a new vendor for the 401k program or something. And so I really like the level of transparency. I like knowing everything that's going on, and I like the level of trust that sort of both requires and also like reinforces within the company. And then I think our engineering culture is similar to yours in that we set a couple of sort of guardrails. So any code that goes to production needs to be seen by 2 sets of eyes. So some people do it through pair programming, some people do it through code review, and you have to write tests. But what project management tool you use, what agile methodology you use, how you choose to prioritize work, that's totally up to the team, because we just want people to set aggressive goals and hit them, and how they get there is up to them as much as possible.
What about from a team size point of view? How do you guys organize from 5 people, 6 people?
So individual teams are all less than, I think our biggest team is probably 10, but even within a team of 10, it tends to break down into several smaller sub-teams. So my team is 7 right now, but we're effectively like 3 teams working on sort of 3 projects at the moment. So teams range from sort of 2 to 4 right now, at least within my area. I think some of the other teams may be a little bit larger, but I think 6 is probably a realistic upper bound for a project.
Mm-hmm.
You touched on office space a little bit. I think most students have the vision of a startup of kind of Nerf guns and foosball tables and things like that. What's the true story of what the office environment is like, what the daily schedule is like, how many video games I get to play through the course of the day?
Yeah, so I think our office is a little bit less like the traditional startup office than a lot of them. Part of it is the sort of the area we're in and the number of external partners we interact with. Bankers don't really take kindly to being shot in the face with a Nerf gun as they walk by. But I'd say I think our office really reflects our company. It's very open and transparent. Everything is very sort of built with a very clean aesthetic, with an eye towards sort of usability and design. And I think in a lot of ways, like the team and the company and the office you build is the product you build. And I suspect it's very similar for SoundCloud, but that same focus applies sort of on many different levels as you build.
Yeah, I think the only stereotypical thing that we have is there's at least one ping pong table in every SoundCloud office. It's not foosball at SoundCloud, it's ping pong. It's either one or the other, I find.
We have pool.
Oh, right on. Yeah, but totally agree. Like the type of company or the type of culture that you build is a reflection of your product. It's another product. For us, it's a very well. There's a few things. Like there's a very strong European influence. It's a little bit more laid back in terms of timetables and whatnot. Certainly I've shown up at Berlin office at 9 a.m. and I think there's a few people there, but it's not the ideal. It's more like 10 a.m. Some people start to trickle in, and then people are often there till 9 p.m. So it's really up to you to figure out, what's your ideal schedule, work that out with your team, whatever works, and just sort of work around that. In terms of transparency and in terms of just social, like how we socialize and whatnot, every Friday we alternate demos or all hands. So demos is an opportunity to kind of show off to the whole company what you've been working on if it's at a state where you can kind of show it off, even if it's really beta, not ready to ship yet. And then all hands is our sort of, get the whole company together, every department gets a chance to kind of highlight what they're working on and get feedback and all of that. And for both of those, they happen at Friday at 5 p.m. Berlin time, and they're streamed out to all the remote offices. But we also rent out a bar for that time and just sit there, and it's open bar, everyone chills out. It doesn't feel very stuffy and whatnot. It's a good time to kind of wind back, relax, and
Not
socialize.
a formal company meeting, but more of a gathering.
More of a gathering,
That's
exactly.
We have something similar. We have a company all hands we call Town Square on Fridays, and we get up. Our CFO goes through all of our metrics, how much money we made in the last week, how many users signed up. We answer questions that get posted to an internal forum. So the top 3 voted questions get answered in front of everybody as a chance to show off launches and demonstrate like new stuff that's going up. And yeah, it's fun. Like there's beer, there's wine, there's pizza. It's a good time.
So let's talk a little bit about what it's like to get a job at both of your companies. So we talked a little bit about kind of how students can show themselves off in that process. What is an interview process like? Let's set some student expectations about how many interviews would they go through, how difficult is the process, what's the experience like?
So one of the things that we emphasize, I'll talk mostly about the engineering interview process because that's the one I'm most familiar with. One of the things that we really emphasize in the engineering interviews is actually writing code. So the majority of our interviews, particularly for college students, actually all of our interviews involve sitting down in front of a computer with an engineer from Square and actually just writing code for an hour. Together. So we have dedicated machines set up for this in the office. They're just a bunch of iMacs with 2 keyboards and 2 mice plugged in. Students can do the problem in any language, with any editor. The goal is to make them as comfortable as possible and give them a chance to sort of show off what they can do. So all the engineers at Square have developed their own interviewing question, and they're all designed to take a little bit more than an hour to realistically get through, so you don't run out of stuff to do. We'll sit down with a student, explain the problem, and basically spend an hour seeing how far we can get. And we're there to answer questions and sort of guide them in the right direction and make sure that we sort of get as much material covered in that hour as possible. So an ideal question does some stuff around data structures, around algorithms, around code design, around testing, around tool like comfort. And in general, our goal is to give students a chance to show off what they can do and give them a chance, as many chances as possible to sort of be successful.
What can the student do to best prepare for that process? I've got to imagine that's not the exact same experience that they've had either coding on their own or with class projects. What's the best way to prep for that kind of an experience?
I think I'm going to sound like a broken record, but doing side projects, like going from I've got an empty directory to I've got something that works, that's basically the experience. And we always try to make people comfortable and like make sure they don't stress out too much about it. And ideally, like a lot of people come out of it and say it was really fun and they actually had a good time. Because the first few minutes, you're nervous, you have somebody watching you as you type. But once you actually get into it, like most CS students are most comfortable with a keyboard in hand and like writing code, not at a whiteboard writing stuff up or answering questions on a phone or something like
that. Yeah, we're a little bit different in that right now we don't have a specific recruiting tactic for new grads. So all of our engineering interviews more or less go the same way, and I'll stick to engineering interviews too because I actually have no idea what. But the typical process for us is it usually starts out with a phone screen or two, and that's where you'll speak to somebody either on our recruiting team or actually it usually is two. You'll speak to somebody on our recruiting team, and then they'll try to figure out kind of what you're more interested in that's going on at SoundCloud, and then match you up with somebody on that team to have another phone screen. Should you kind of get through that stage of the process, then we usually actually send people a coding challenge. And we have a bunch of GitHub repositories that you can go check out just on github.com/SoundCloud. And they'll have like a back-end engineer coding challenge or a front-end challenge and whatnot. And these are close approximations of real-world problems, like specially selected real-world problems that shouldn't take you more than a day or two to kind of work out in your spare time. But what we ask is then, you follow the instructions. It shows that you can follow instructions. It shows that, you get the output that we've requested. You have tests in the format that we've requested, et cetera. And then we have the team that you're applying to kind of, evaluate your coding challenge. If there's no red flags there, often there's a back and forth where we just ask some questions about why did you decide to do things this way or why did you decide that way. Then often you're brought in. And at that point, we have the same thing where every engineer kind of has their favorite set of questions and whatnot. We also have a document that we share amongst all the engineering teams where people can kind of put their favorite questions. So if you're ever looking for just a set of baseline questions, and these are things about data structures, algorithms, but we try to mix those in with other things that are real-world problems, usually to deal with kind of testing the boundaries of a person's knowledge. So in a typical large complex architecture, you're going to have various pieces. You're going to have everything from debugging problems at the end of the load balancer all the way down to the data store persistence layer or whatnot. So we want to get an idea of like, do you specifically with large web infrastructures, how do you kind of conceptualize problems? How do you what's your mental model? And where do you have gaps in that mental model, which is totally okay, but we just want to kind of know, are you aware of where you're strong and where you're not, et cetera.
Yeah, I think there's a good tip in there for anybody who's going through interviews, which is the interview process should be hard.
Yeah.
Because if you breeze through it, then and you're not challenged, then that place is probably not going to be challenging to you in general.
You know that you'll probably work with people who are not going to be mentoring you, for instance.
And on the flip side, as an interviewer, like we want to push people past their boundaries so we can find out where those boundaries are. Like if somebody 100% is a problem, you don't know if they made it to 110% or 130%. So I always try and challenge people basically like to the point where they're almost uncomfortable in the interview.
The hard interview process is good. Great. So let's transition and start to take some questions from the student community. So I'm going to look down here at my phone. So the first question we've got from Tom at the University of Michigan: are there any technical skills or frameworks that are especially popular among developers at your companies, or that you recommend students to be learning today?
I think you can probably name any tool or framework, and there's somebody at Square who is a fan of it. So I think when we hire people, we don't look for expertise in a particular tool or framework. We're really looking for people's ability to learn quickly, to adapt to new situations, and sort of raw programming and like systems ability. And I think people should definitely explore frameworks because there's a lot of interesting ideas there. And the broader you go, the more you'll sort of see commonalities and like learn new things. But I wouldn't say there's one in particular that people should focus on.
So there's not a particular programming language that you have to know in order to be an employee.
No, I completely agree. We don't look for X number of years of experience using this. It certainly might help if your experience exactly matches what we tend to look for in various teams, but really it's not as important as being able to think on your feet, learn new stuff. There's a great book actually, Andy Thomas, I think, or no, yeah, I forget the author's names, but it's Pragmatic Programmer. And one of the suggestions in that book is actually, as a practicing software developer, try to learn a new language every year or two new languages every year, because the more sort of flexibility you show in this regard, the more you're going to sort of pull out the abstractions and figure out what really is going on here, rather than focusing on the syntax and semantics of a specific language. And you think about problem solving differently. We look for people who think about problem solving in creative, cool ways.
Yeah, I mentioned the pair programming interviews that I do. People choose whatever editor they want, whatever language they want. At this point, I've done it in Java, Ruby, Python, JavaScript, Perl, PHP, Objective-C, C#. Somebody started to do it in Scala, but turns out they didn't know Scala that well. So
Yeah.
but it really I don't have any preference when people choose. PHP is a little bit of a hassle, but everything else is fine.
Yeah, the coding challenges I mentioned, I mean, we accept those for the back-end challenge, for instance. That can be in any language. And I've seen them come through in Node.js. I've seen them come through in Ruby on Rails, Python, Java, Scala, you name it. Even saw a Clojure one, which was neat to see. For the front end, obviously, it's JavaScript, HTML. There's really no getting away from that. But for other stuff, it really doesn't matter.
Great. All right, let's go to a question from Hadar at UCLA. How is the products department structured in your organizations, and how does the department interact and relate with the rest of the company? I know you guys are mostly on the engineering teams, but you interact with product folks.
Mm-hmm. So at Square, we don't have a distinction between sort of product and engineering. There's development teams that are focused on a particular product or particular audience, and it's made up of engineers, designers, and product people. And so the goal is that team should have everything they need to sort of move independently and make decisions quickly and ship stuff out to customers as fast as possible. So product is sort of an integral part of that development experience.
Mm-hmm. Are they technical product folks, or with an engineering background, or are they business folks generally? What's the mix?
It's definitely a mix between the two. We have some who come from a finance background, some who come from a design background, and some who come from an engineering background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very similar actually at SoundCloud. So we have a VP product role, and technically speaking, product managers report to that VP product role, but they're very much embedded in the engineering teams that they work with. So we have product managers for things like our mobile team, our trust and safety have a product manager, you name it. And these people work are sitting with engineers typically who are working on that team. And really just kind of act as almost advocates for those engineers too, making sure it's a two-way street. They make sure that the engineers know what they need to know and make sure that they're not inundated with requests from all different parts of the organization. But then they also make sure that what they're working on is in line with the overall product vision.
I mean, there's a good sub-question I think here, which is what does a product manager do? My roommate was a product manager at Google and now at a gaming company, and he's got a great description of it, which is as a product manager, you have to understand that if you didn't show up to work every day, stuff would still happen. Unlike engineers and designers, where if they stopped showing up to work, nothing would happen. So your job is to figure out how you showing up to work makes everybody else so much more effective that they're really happy to have you there.
Coming from an engineer. All right, let's go to the next question. So Pete from Diablo Valley College. Do startups provide any training in specific programming languages, or do they expect students to know most things? We talked a little bit about the programming languages. Do you guys do anything special as it relates to helping students or employees learn new languages or anything along those lines?
I mean, I mentioned that we don't have a strong preference for people coming in with a particular language or framework experience or anything like that. And the other side of that is that when people show up, we expect some of them to not know our stack, and that we're going to be teaching them or getting them up to speed. And most programming languages don't take that long to learn. It may take you longer to get comfortable and really feel confident in it, but sitting down with somebody who's experienced in that stack and spending a few weeks working side by side with them, and most people are up and running.
Yes. absolutely the same. Working with your team is the learning experience oftentimes. And I think the sort of level of difficulty of learning a new programming language or a new framework is usually lower than the level of difficulty of learning a new code base and learning a new stack, right? Like for products that are the size of Square or SoundCloud, you're going to have to learn about a lot of architectural complexity. And because of that, you can ship on your first day, but we don't expect you to be leading a major product in the first day, So oftentimes it's one and the same, working with your team and learning a new framework. We do have this notion that a lot of companies do called 20% time. We call it hacker time at SoundCloud. And oftentimes I've noticed actually people will either work on their own personal projects or they'll take 20% time just because they want to learn something like a new language out of intellectual curiosity. Yeah. Or maybe they do have an eye towards working on this team down the road and they'd like to learn Go or they'd like to learn Scala. Maybe they've only done Ruby before. So people do often use their 20% time for learning.
Yeah, we have something similar. We actually structure it as hack weeks. So we have 1 week every quarter that's set aside where all work pauses and everybody goes off and builds whatever. And it can be something related to Square or like a new product idea that you've had that you want to explore and build a prototype for. It could be something totally unrelated. Sometimes it's something silly. A couple of hack weeks ago, a team plugged a Bluetooth radio into a soda machine and made it so you could dispense sodas from Square Wallet. Nice. So that was fun. But we've also had a lot of our best product ideas that have come out of prototypes people built during that time. And one of the things that people will do is they'll build a new idea and learn a new language or a new framework at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, you reminded me, another thing that we do a lot of is attend and organize hack days, which is a big part of my job. So as an engineer, you'll have opportunities to go out to music hack days, especially. We send people to every single music hack day, and that's where companies like Spotify, RDO, us get together and sort of figure out cool new stuff to build. And we also have internal hack days once a quarter. So we call those We Hack. And the idea is you're definitely encouraged to work with people who are not in your team, because that would be just like work, right? So these are optional things that you can go to, but we've had some cool stuff like the last one I worked with a team on building an Arduino and Raspberry Pi device where you could like shake it and it would play a sound from SoundCloud, or you could push a button, and the whole idea was it was a children's toy with sounds from SoundCloud. So
that's great.
A lot of neat stuff that you can do.
All right, let's go back to the feed here. So Jenna at Berkeley, how difficult is it to balance between personal life and professional life, and how does it compare to working at a much larger company? I think this is a really important question. We've talked about all of the benefits of learning a lot, having lots of breadth of responsibility. What's the trade-off or is there a trade-off with work-life balance?
So I'm very opinionated about this, actually. I think it's a myth that startups encourage you more than other companies to really burn yourself out, because there is this persistent myth that if you work for a startup, you're going to be doing 80-hour work weeks, you're never going to put it down. I've seen people at big companies do exactly the same thing, and I think it really speaks to your personal perspective on your own health and your own intellectual development, et cetera, and also the company culture. Some companies, I think, do certainly encourage that more than other companies. The companies that I've enjoyed working for the most, and SoundCloud definitely falls into this category, encourage you to take time away. Like they encourage you to say, like, I've had engineering managers walk around and see people working at like 10 p.m. and being like, weren't you in at noon? You should go home, because if you do rely on people like sort of burning the candle at both ends, they are going to burn out pretty quickly, and also the quality of their work deteriorates over time. So I think it's really up to you, and it's up to picking the company that you work for. If you know that a company is known for having a culture where people never leave, then it might not be a good fit. But I don't think startups do it more or less than other companies.
Is it a fair question, you think, for a student or any prospective employee to ask, how many hours should I expect to work?
Yeah, I would. Yeah. I mean, like we mentioned earlier, I think the interview process is a great time to sort of learn a lot about a company, and that's absolutely a fair question to ask of everybody who interviews you and get a sense for, because it'll likely vary. I think you mentioned that engineering managers go around and tell people to go home. That's certainly something that I've had to do. Yeah. Also have to remind people to take vacation. We have an unlimited vacation policy, so people can take as many days off a year as they want, which usually entails me reminding people they need to take time off and they need to go out and do something outside of the office. But I think it varies from company to company and from person to person. For a lot of, one of the reasons startups may get this myth is that people tend to be very passionate about the things they're working on in their projects. And it's probably per capita a higher level of passion at a small company than a big one. And I think that when you're really excited about something and you're working with your team and you just like hit the groove, it's hard to tear yourself away from that and go home. And it's not because people feel that they have to be there. It's because people want to be there.
Yeah.
Your work ends up becoming your hobby as well.
Yeah.
It's fun.
There's a great tweet last week about programmers. It's like, what's your job? Programming. What's your hobby? Programming. What do you do when you're not doing those things? Think about programming.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
I like that.
Yeah.
So I started my career in finance, and the big thing I found between the difference of working 80 hours for an investment bank or 80 hours at a startup is I get to control the 80 hours. I know I can work when I want. No one's telling me when to get in, when to leave. And I think that most startups have that level of flexibility and autonomy.
Exactly.
I mean, I think every small company is goal oriented. It's delivering stuff. It's getting done the things you say you're going to get done, and how you get there is, I think, less important than it would be at a big company.
I think what we're both getting, or something that we're both getting at without explicitly saying it, is in terms of advice for somebody who's a student who's looking to start in this industry, recognize that you're not going to be in the long term more productive. You may make trade-offs sometimes. You may really want to work, 10 hours that day, or you may really want to work on the weekend because you're really excited what you're working on. But be careful, because you could burn out really quickly without knowing that you're doing it, and the quality of your work may deteriorate over time. So just be cognizant of that. And
I think it's really that at small companies you need to take a little bit more responsibility for your work-life balance than you might at a big company, and you have to be more conscious of it. As something I mentioned earlier about small companies being great for people who are good at self-management. Yeah. And part of that is managing your work-life balance and figuring out when you are most productive and when you should work. Mm-hmm.
So I've got a business student question from CMU, Silvio. What about business students? What are you looking for when hiring non-engineering students? I know you guys aren't actively involved with that. Maybe the better way to ask the question is there a way for a business student or a marketing student to get into the organization? What would be the process for that?
Honestly, I think it's all the same qualities.
Yeah, I think it's very
self-management, self-starter, somebody who's able to really research the company, find out what it is about the company that appeals to them, how they can make a significant impact. I think that applies just as well if you're an engineer, a marketing student, a business student, et cetera.
I've done a lot of interviews of, being part of the international team, I've done a lot of interviews of non-engineering people to join sort of the business half of the team. And I look for a lot of the same things in people, and I think it's startups like ours have sort of an unlimited appetite for engineers and designers, but we're always more than happy and even excited to talk to really talented people across a variety of functions, because we've got a huge set of challenges and we need help across sort of all of them, and so we just want great people, no matter sort of what their background is.
Oh yeah.
You both had talked about kind of taking the initiative to do something outside of the classroom. Do people need formal CS degrees or engineering degrees if they can demonstrate that they can write code?
Absolutely not. Some of our best engineers dropped out of college or didn't go at all. Or we have one of our iOS engineers is leading major projects now for our next release, and he's 19. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the way I think about it, companies that are goal-oriented, and startups tend to be goal-oriented, are looking for doers. And if your CS degree helps you be a doer, then that's fantastic. If you have a CS degree and you're not a doer, then really there's not a good fit, right? Yeah. But if you're a doer and you don't have a CS degree, that's just as well, a good fit.
Awesome. So we've got time for one more question, and I'm going to try. We've talked a little bit about what students can do, but if you had one piece of advice to give a student, whether it's for an internship or a job, what's the one thing that students should leave here tonight saying, I'm going to go do this tonight or tomorrow?
Get involved in your technical communities. So if you use a tool, get involved in the community that's around that tool. I think that's the biggest thing, because everything else seems to stem from that. That means that you might be a little bit more confident in terms of approaching people in that community who work for cool companies. That means that you recognize that there's really no difference between you and other people in the industry. It's all just experience. So just, if you're into programming in Ruby, get involved in the Ruby community. If you're into programming in Python, get involved in the Python community. Go to meetups, go to Tech Talks, et cetera. Meet people.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. If I had to pick a different one, I think I would choose practice going from an idea to something concrete in the world. So go from a sketch on a piece of paper and an empty Git repository to something that is in the hands of real users. I think that experience and going through that cycle a few times is incredibly valuable.
Awesome, guys. Well, it's been a great hour spending with you guys. I'm sure the students are going to leave here tonight more empowered about the things that they should be doing in order to get job opportunities, more knowledgeable about the cultures at both of your organizations. So I want to thank you guys both for coming here tonight. I also want to thank all the student organizers across the country that have kind of pulled together these viewing parties to help other students get involved and hear more about startup life and SoundCloud and Square. And with that, there'll be some follow-up. We'll end up sending out a survey to all the students that attended. Let us know what you thought about tonight. If you've got companies that you'd like to see, if there's more things that you'd like to hear about startup life, whether it's more culture questions, more programming questions, those types of things, let us know. We want to make these sessions as valuable as possible for you. So with that, I'll wrap it up, guys. Thanks very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Take care.